The family was getting news of the mood in London, and advice from every quarter: politicians, friends, historians and VIPs from all over the world, and the newspapers were screaming at them to come back to the capital. "They're up in bloody Scotland," was the common cry, or, "They should be here. Those children should be here." The absence of a flag flying at Buckingham Palace became another focus for anger. While flags were flying at half-mast all over the country, at the Queen's official London residence there was nothing. Just mountains of flowers piling up outside. "Show us you care," demanded the Express. "Your subjects are suffering, speak to us, ma'am," said the Mirror. "Where is our Queen? Where is her flag?" shouted the Sun. It was a problem of protocol. The only flag that flies at Buckingham Palace is the royal standard, and only then when the sovereign is in residence. And it never flies at half-mast because, technically, the sovereign is never dead. The instant one dies, another succeeds. The king is dead. Long live the king. The people didn't give a damn about protocol. They wanted to see some feeling, some indication that the royal family was affected by the death of the princess. There had been none, and this most elementary of gestures, the lowering of a flag, had not been observed. To the press and to the nation this embodied everything that was irrelevant and out of touch about the monarchy in the 1990s, and stood in stark contrast to the warmth and compassion of the princess. It caused a furious row internally, and in the heat of the moment it was suggested that Sir Robert Fellows might impale himself on his own flagstaff. Eventually, the Queen was persuaded, and on the Thursday a Union flag was raised to half-mast. While the headlines ranted and the leaders thundered, entire forests were devoted to the saintliness of the princess, and for those papers that had been attacking her just days before for her antics in the Mediterranean, it involved a dramatic U-turn. "She was the butterfly who shone with the light of glamour which illuminated all our lives," said the Express. "A comet streaked across the sky of public life and entranced the world," said the Times, and the Daily Mail called her a gem of purest ray serene. The Prince of Wales, via Stephen Lamport, was getting graphic updates on what was happening on the streets from Sandy Henney, his press secretary. "You can't read about this," she said, "you can't even see it on television. There is real hatred building up here, and the public is incensed by your silence." But, although some were urging him to make a statement, Charles recognized that he was not the one to take the lead. On the Tuesday, the Daily Mail headline read, "Charles weeps bitter tears of guilt," printed above a photograph of him taken some months before. The royal family was appalled, and from that morning onwards they stopped putting the newspapers out on display at the castle. He knew that any public expression of sadness from him would be a red rag to a bull. But as the days went by and the anger mounted, and his mother's advisers still saw no need to put on a public display of emotion, he became more forceful. He also realized that the boys needed to be prepared for what awaited them when they went back to London: the mountains of flowers and tributes, the crowds, the emotion, and asked Sandy to come up to Balmoral to speak to them, as he often did, when there was something confrontational or difficult to impart. A week or so before, he had asked her up to Burkhall, the Queen Mother's home on the Balmoral estate, where Charles himself often stayed, to speak to William. The prince did not, however, ask Sandy to Balmoral in order to talk the boys into walking behind the cortege at the funeral, as Alistair Campbell claimed in his diaries, the Blair years. The Prime Minister's former spin doctor believes that the prince was frightened that if he walked without William, he might be attacked by members of the public. His theory is that Sandy persuaded the princes that their mother would have wanted them to do it. Initially, he said, William's hatred of the media was so great that he refused to talk to anyone about taking part in the funeral, and saw walking as appeasing the media. At no time, Sandy says, was there ever a question of using the boys as a barrier against possible reaction from the public towards my boss. But there was genuine concern as to what reaction the public might have to the Prince of Wales, and indeed any member of the royal family from a highly emotionally, some may say irrationally, charged public. The boys talked about walking with the cortege to close members of their family and only those they trusted, and no one they talked to at that time would ever speak to a third party about what the children said. I think Mr. Campbell might be that third party she's referring to." Sandy needed to explain to the boys the extraordinary scenes they could expect to see on the streets of London. "I was going up and down these queues of people, waiting to sign the books of condolence at St. James's Palace," she remembers, "and I couldn't believe what I was hearing, the things they were saying about the Queen and the Duke and the Prince. It was verging on hatred for this family." She was as loyal an advocate of the institution of monarchy as you could hope to find, and like most of the people who have worked for the Prince of Wales, she was devoted to him and passionate about his children. She took them aside and said, "Mummy's death has had the most amazing impact on people. They are really sad because they loved her very, very much and they miss her, and when you go down to London you will see something you will never, ever, see again, and it may come as a bit of a shock. But everything you will see is because the public thought so much of your mummy. It is the sign of their grief for your loss. We want you to know about it so you will be ready for it." She asked if they wanted to ask any questions, and there were many, but they were all to do with why she was telling them this, why people were behaving in this way. Harry was the one with the curiosity. William was very quiet and contained. Later, Sandy was up in the tower at Balmoral, where letters were pouring in by the thousand. Harry arrived with Tiggs and said, "What are you doing?" "I explained that all of these people wanted to say how sorry they are that your mummy's dead and that they're thinking of you." "Can I open some?" said Harry, snatching up some envelopes. "Of course you can. Go on, help yourself." She was a motherly figure, with no children of her own, but stepchildren, and she was the perfect person for the sensitive task of coaxing the boys out of their shell. She had worked for their father, and known both boys for 4 years, but because of Diana's suspicion that everyone who worked for the other side would betray her or let her down, she hadn't had much to do with them. "Sad," says Sandy simply. "Our view," meaning Alan Percival, her predecessor, "was that if you let one of them down, you let the children down, but more importantly, you let the institution down." William was no longer a young boy, but not yet a man. It was a difficult age. He didn't speak to Sandy about his feelings or his mother, and she never saw a tear. He appeared to internalize the grief, just as he had internalized so much in his life already. He never allowed much of himself to be exposed in all the years she worked with him, from the age of 11 to 18, and he was always more guarded than his brother. He was always someone who seemed to be dealing with whatever situation arose in his own way. "I think he has an innate sense of self-protection," Sandy says, "and wouldn't have answered questions about his mother even if I'd asked him. He'd have been polite. He's a politician, that man. He can charm people. If you ask him a personal question he will be as honest as he wants to be, but you will never get down, thank God, into the real root of William, because that's how he protects himself." The day the flag appeared on the roof of Buckingham Palace, the family ventured out of the gates of Balmoral for the first time since the day of Diana's death. William and Harry expressed a desire to go to church again, so the prince took the opportunity to give them a small taster of what awaited them in London. The funeral was just 2 days away. There were hundreds of flowers and tributes, but nothing compared to those that had piled up outside Kensington Palace, where there were said to be 1 million bouquets and goodness knows how many teddy bears and other offerings, 1.5 meters deep in places. There were almost as many outside Buckingham Palace. About 60 members of the press were waiting outside the gates of Balmoral that day, a crowd for the Highlands, yet they uttered not a single word as the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, Peter Phillips, who had flown up to be with his cousins, the Prince of Wales and his sons, stepped out of their cars to look at the flowers and the tributes. The only sound to be heard, apart from the clicking of the camera shutters, was the voices of the royal party. It was the first time in the 5 days since their mother's death that the country had seen Diana's boys. It was a touching scene. All 3 princes, father and sons, were visibly moved by what they saw and taken aback by the messages attached to the bouquets. "Look at this one, Papa," said Harry, grabbing hold of his father's hand and tugging him down. "Read this one." Captured on film, the gesture was surprising, if not shocking. The Prince of Wales did seem to have a heart after all. He actually held his son's hand, something no one could ever have imagined before. And he seemed to have aged. Of all the criticisms Diana threw at the prince during their bitter war of words, the one that hurt the most was that he was unfeeling and cold. It was patently untrue, as anyone who has seen Charles with his children knows very well. Diana knew it too, and later regretted her words. The sight of the Prince of Wales and his sons did much to soften the public mood, and when the Queen made a surprising live television broadcast that Friday evening before Saturday's funeral, the mood softened further. The fact that it was only the second time during her reign that she had broadcast to the nation other than at Christmas, the first being during the Gulf War, made it an additionally impressive gesture. Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death. We have all been trying in our different ways to cope. It is not easy to express a sense of loss, since the initial shock is often succeeded by a mixture of other feelings: disbelief, incomprehension, anger, and concern for all who remain. We have all felt those emotions in these last few days. So what I say to you now, as your queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her, for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys. This week at Balmoral, we have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and the rest of us have suffered. No one who knew Diana will ever forget her. Millions of others who never met her, but felt they knew her, will remember her. I for one believe that there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. The Queen's words possibly prevented a revolution.